A deck chair collapses on the patio of a seaside villa west of Lisbon. The man sitting in it is 79 years old. He has run Portugal for 36 years. His head strikes the hard floor. A few weeks later, surgeons remove a blood clot from his brain. Then he sinks into a coma. The country waits for him to die. He doesn't. The man who fell off the chair in Estoril had not chosen any of this. Antonio de Oliveira Salazar was born in 1889 in Vimiero, a small village in central Portugal, the son of an estate manager. He went to a seminary, took minor orders, and almost became a priest before deciding on law instead. He took a chair in political economy at the University of Coimbra and would have stayed there for the rest of his life if Portugal had not been falling apart. In 1928, 2 years after the army had overthrown the parliamentary republic, the generals brought him in to fix the budget. He insisted on full control of state finances as the price of accepting. They gave it. The escudo stabilized, the deficits became surpluses, and by the summer of 1932 the quiet professor who had agreed to be finance minister was Prime Minister of Portugal, a position he then held without interruption for the next 36 years. The state he built around himself was called the Estado Novo, the new state, and it was designed not so much to govern Portugal as to absorb whatever Portugal might want from it. On paper it was corporatist, workers and employers organised into syndicates, a national assembly composed entirely of regime supporters, a single political body called the União Nacional that Salazar marketed as a non-party. There were no real elections. The newspapers went to the censor before they went to the printer. Portuguese were offered 3 official slogans: God, Fatherland, Family, and a culture its critics summed up as Fado, Fatima, and football. The music, the Marian Shrine, the matches that filled the stadiums on Sunday afternoon. The public space in which Portuguese could disagree about anything important narrowed every year, and most of them, after 30 years of it, no longer remembered what it had felt like to disagree about anything at all. What kept that public space narrow was the secret police. Founded in 1933 and renamed PIDE in 1945, it became one of the most efficient repressive forces in 20th century Europe. A network of informers ordinary Portuguese never quite stopped suspecting one another of belonging to. Its prison camp at Tarrafal, on a remote island in Cape Verde, took the regime's most stubborn opponents and held them under conditions designed to ensure many of them did not return. The camp closed in 1954. After the African Wars began in 1961, it was reopened to receive a new generation of prisoners, this time from Angola, Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde itself. Across the regime's lifetime, around 30,000 people passed through its political prisons. The system did not need to be enormously violent. It needed only to be predictable, and it was. It was tested with any seriousness only twice. In May 1958, an Air Force general called Humberto Delgado stood for the Portuguese presidency against Salazar's hand-picked candidate. Asked at a campaign rally in Porto what he would do if elected, Delgado said he would dismiss Salazar. The phrase electrified the country. The official results, which nobody trusted, gave him about a quarter of the vote. He fled to the Brazilian embassy and into exile, and from Brazil and Algeria he spent the next 7 years embarrassing the regime with raids and broadcasts. In February 1965, Portuguese secret police agents lured him to a meeting near the Spanish border and killed him there, along with his Brazilian secretary. 3 years before that, in April 1961, the regime had nearly been removed from inside. Defense Minister General Botelho Muniz had judged that Salazar's African policy was leading Portugal into a war it could not win, and had approached the president to seek Salazar's removal under the constitution. The plan failed within hours, and Botelho Muniz was dismissed before lunch. From then on, the African colonies became the regime's untouchable principle, even as the army that would have to defend them took 13 more years to reach the opposite conclusion. By the summer of 1968, Salazar was 79 and had outlived everyone who had once threatened him. He had outlived Delgado. He had outlived the generals who had appointed him. He had outlived Mussolini and Stalin and most of the European political class he had been a contemporary of in the 1930s. His summers were spent at a modest seaside villa in São João do Estoril, where he received papers and met ministers and worked through the regime's business as he always had. He had never married. He had never named a successor. The constitutional question of what would happen if he died had been left unanswered, partly because he disliked the idea, and partly because nobody around him dared to raise it. On the 3rd of August, the deck chair on the patio collapsed under him. A few weeks after the fall, surgeons opened Salazar's skull and removed a blood clot from his brain. The operation seemed to go well. Then he slipped into a coma, and for several weeks the cabinet that had run Portugal under his direction met without him, waiting for news that did not come. By early September, the doctors gave their verdict. Salazar would not return to office. He would not, in any meaningful sense, be returning to himself. The Portuguese constitution had a clear answer to what happened next. The President of the Republic appointed the Prime Minister, and that was the President's prerogative. The President in 1968 was Admiral Américo Tomás, a man Salazar had personally arranged to install 10 years earlier after Humberto Delgado's election scare. Tomás was loyal, cautious, and entirely a creature of the regime he had been appointed to crown. He now had to choose Salazar's successor, and his options were narrow. The regime had no designated heir. On the 27th of September 1968, Tomás appointed Marcelo Caetano. Caetano was 62 years old, a law professor who had once been rector of the University of Lisbon. He had helped draft the Estado Novo constitution back in 1933 as a young scholar, and had served the regime for most of his adult life, though he had quietly resigned in 1962 over disagreements about university reform. He was not Salazar. He was more worldly, more open to the changing Europe outside Portugal's borders, but he was a man the regime trusted to keep the regime running. Then Salazar woke up. He was paralyzed on his right side. His speech was impaired. His perception of the world around him was, by every account, badly damaged. But he was awake, and his mind, in the sense that he could still talk and reason and read, was working. By early 1969, he had been moved from the hospital to his official residence at the São Bento Palace in Lisbon. He sat up in bed and asked for the day's newspapers. He asked when the next cabinet meeting would be. He asked who had been managing things while he was ill. The men around him made a choice. They could tell him the truth, that he had been replaced, that the country was being run by Caetano, that his 36 years in office had ended on a patio in Estoril, or they could lie. They lied. The mechanics of the lie were elaborate. Former ministers visited and held meetings as if the cabinet still convened around him. They brought papers for him to sign, papers that had no legal force whatsoever. Administrative theatre printed for an audience of one. The editor of his preferred newspaper, Diário da Manhã, printed a single bespoke daily edition, removing references to the Caetano government and substituting older or invented stories that suggested the world Salazar had ruled was still the world outside his window. Visitors were briefed on what to say and what not to say. Big news from beyond Portugal's borders was filtered. Some accounts say he was never told that Americans had walked on the moon in July 1969. The fiction held for nearly 2 years. Salazar lived inside it until the 27th of July 1970, when he died at the age of 81. Whether he ever genuinely understood what had happened to him is a question historians still argue about. Some of his aides claimed afterwards that he had quietly grasped the situation and chosen to play along, content to keep up appearances. Others, including the British biographer Tom Gallagher, have argued that the deception was real and largely successful. We will probably never know for certain. The men who knew either way had a strong professional interest in the version that left their own conduct in the better light. The thing worth pausing over is that this was not, in the end, a story unique to one ailing dictator. The regime had been doing a version of this to Portugal for 40 years. The single fake newspaper printed for Salazar in his bedroom was a small-scale version of what the censor's office had been doing to every other newspaper in the country since 1933. The cabinet meetings that produced no decisions were the public Estado Novo with the volume turned down, a National Assembly composed entirely of regime supporters, had been holding decisions that were not decisions for decades. The Portuguese had been living inside a curated edition of their own country for so long that printing one for the dictator himself was, in a strange way, just the regime turning its own techniques inward. Outside the bedroom, the country was no longer pretending so successfully. The colonial wars that had begun in 1961 were now in their 8th year and showed no sign of ending. Conscripts continued to leave Lisbon for Angola, Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau. Caetano had inherited the wars along with everything else, and he had inherited them without inheriting the international authority his predecessor had once commanded. The man who could once silence a problem by deciding to was now a paralysed figure in a bedroom, signing nothing, and the men who had taken his place had to govern a real country with real problems they could not lie their way out of. The fiction of Salazar's continuing rule lasted until July 1970. The fiction of the Estado Novo's continuing legitimacy would last another 4 years. For about a year, it almost looked like things might change. Caetano spoke a different kind of language from Salazar, less austere, more managerial, willing to use the word modernization without quite meaning it. His slogan was Evolução na continuidade, evolution within continuity. The Portuguese press called the period the Primavera Marcelista, the Marcelist Spring. There were real changes. Caetano introduced a monthly pension for rural workers who had never paid into the social security system, and for some of those workers, it was the first state money they had ever seen. He renamed the secret police. PIDE became the DGS, the General Directorate of Security, and went on doing exactly what it had always done with a new letterhead. He authorised Portugal's first independent labour union since the 1920s. The press laws were rewritten in 1972, and prior censorship, the system that required articles to be cleared before printing, was retained. The old bargain of the regime had always been order in exchange for silence. Caetano was offering a slightly less complete silence in exchange for the same order. The trouble was that the order was now expensive. The wars in Africa had begun in March 1961 with an armed rising in northern Angola and spread to Guinea-Bissau in 1963 and Mozambique in 1964. Salazar had famously declared that Portugal would go to Angola rapidamente e con força, quickly and with force. Quickly was a word that turned out not to apply. 13 years later, the wars were still being fought across 3 theatres and 2 continents, and Portugal, a country of about 9 million people, was sustaining one of the largest armies in NATO to fight them. Portuguese forces grew from 79,000 men in 1961 to 217,000 by 1974, and around 40% of the national budget was going to the military. The men sent to fight were Portuguese conscripts. Service was 3 years long, most of it in Africa, and a generation grew up knowing that the lottery of where they were posted would decide the rest of their lives. By 1974, Portuguese figures counted 8,831 dead and 15,507 wounded. Tens of thousands more came home with what we would now call post-traumatic stress, and what at the time was barely recognised. African losses across the 3 theatres ran higher, by some estimates much higher, and were never officially counted. Tens of thousands had refused outright, emigrating illegally during the 1960s, mainly to France and the United States to avoid the draft. The composition of the army changed as the wars went on. In 1961, around 18% of Portuguese forces fighting in Africa were African themselves, recruited locally. By 1974, that figure was over half. The regime that called Angola and Mozambique overseas provinces rather than colonies was, by the end, defending those provinces with armies that were majority African. Soldiers who would, when the regime fell, end up on the wrong side of the new governments. In December 1972, a Portuguese commando unit conducted a sweep across 5 villages along the Zambezi River in central Mozambique's Tete province. The largest was called Wiriamu. Estimates of the dead vary, around 150 by the Red Cross's later count, around 300 by a Portuguese newspaper investigation decades on, approximately 400 in the original report. All of them were civilians. The story would not have travelled if not for 3 priests. 2 Spanish Burgos fathers working in Mozambique gathered the testimony of survivors, and a local Mozambican priest, Padre Domingo Farao, compiled the list of the dead. The account reached a British missionary in England named Adrian Hastings, a former white father who had spent years in Africa himself. On the 10th of July 1973, Hastings published it in the Times of London under the headline, "Portuguese Massacre Reported by Priests." The article appeared a week before Caetano was due in London for a state visit, marking the 600th anniversary of the Anglo-Portuguese alliance. Caetano went anyway. He denied the massacre at a press conference, with his foreign minister translating into English. The regime that had spent 2 years printing a single bespoke newspaper for an old man in Lisbon was now printing a different fiction for the international press. This time, the fiction did not hold. Then the economy started to break. From 1970 onwards, Portugal was running double-digit inflation. In October 1973, after the Yom Kippur War, the price of oil quadrupled. The argument that the war could pay for itself out of Angolan oil revenue had always been a stretch. The 1973 oil shock ended it. The men noticing all of this clearly were the ones doing the actual fighting. Junior officers, captains mostly, were spending their 20s moving between Angola, Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau, watching colleagues die, watching the army's promises about a winnable war turn into longer rotations. They began to talk among themselves. They formed a movement they did not yet have a name for. More senior figures were reaching their own conclusions. In February 1974, General Antonio de Spinola, who had commanded forces in Guinea-Bissau, published a book called Portugal e o Futuro, Portugal and the Future. It argued that the colonial wars could not be won militarily and required a political settlement. The book was approved by the Army's Chief of Staff. It became a bestseller within days. Caetano read it and removed Spinola from command. The captains by then were already meeting in private. They had failed once in March 1974, when a unit at Caldas da Rainha rose against the regime and was contained within hours. Caetano took that failure to mean the army was loyal. The captains took it to mean they had to plan more carefully. They had 6 weeks. At 22:55 on the 24th of April 1974, a disc jockey at Emisores Asociados de Lisboa played a song called E Depois do Adeus by Paolo de Carvalho. It was Portugal's Eurovision entry from 2 weeks earlier, a soft pop ballad that had finished near the bottom of the table. That it played at that minute was the signal. The captains were going. Just over an hour later, at 00:20 on the 25th of April, Radio Renascença, a Catholic station, broadcast Zeca Afonso's Grandola Vila Morena, a song about a small town in the Alentejo that had been semi-banned for years. The second signal confirmed the first. Across Portugal, units of the Movimento das Forças Armadas began moving. The MFA was not a general's movement. It was a captain's movement. Junior officers in their 20s and 30s who had served multiple tours in Africa and reached the same private conclusion. Its strategists were Otelo Saraiva de Carvalho, Vasco Lorenzo and Vitor Alves. The man on the road that night was Captain Salgueiro Maia, 29 years old, leading a column of armoured vehicles north from the cavalry score at Santarém towards Lisbon. By dawn, his column had reached the Torreiro do Passo, the great square on the Tagus where the government ministries stood. There it met the first real test of the morning. Brigadier Junqueira dos Reis arrived with loyalist forces and ordered them to fire on the rebel column. They didn't. A NATO frigate offshore refused. A second lieutenant refused. A corporal called José Alves Costa ordered point-blank to fire from his M47 tank, locked himself inside the vehicle. Maia later called it the most beautiful insubordination of the 25th of April. Caetano had meanwhile slipped out of his official residence and taken refuge in a barracks of the National Republican Guard at the Largo da Carmo. Maia's column moved on and surrounded the building. What happened next was not what any of the actors had planned. The captains had broadcast appeals over the radio asking civilians to stay indoors. The civilians ignored them. They came out into the streets in their thousands, then their tens of thousands walking towards the soldiers. The Lisbon flower market, a few minutes from the Carmo, was full of carnations that morning. They were in season and a delivery had just arrived. People picked them up by the armful and started handing them to the soldiers in the square. Some of the soldiers put the Carnations into the muzzles of their rifles. The image went around the world that afternoon. It also gave the day its name. Inside the Carmo barracks, Caetano was negotiating his own surrender. He told the officers around him that he could not hand over power to a captain, it had to be a general. The captains accommodated him. They sent for Spinola, the general Caetano had removed from command 2 months earlier. By evening, Caetano had handed over power. 4 people were shot dead in Lisbon that day. They were civilians demonstrating outside the headquarters of the DGS when officers inside the building opened fire on the crowd. They were the only fatalities of the 25th of April 1974. The longest-running authoritarian regime in 20th century Europe ended in a square full of flowers, and 4 deaths the regime itself had caused. Caetano was flown to Madeira and then into exile in Brazil, where he died in 1980, after writing books defending the regime he had inherited and lost. The new Portuguese government opened negotiations with the African independence movements within weeks. By the end of 1974, Portuguese forces had withdrawn from Guinea-Bissau. By the end of 1975, Mozambique, Angola, Cape Verde, and São Tomé and Príncipe were independent states, and East Timor had declared its own independence, only to be invaded by Indonesia within days. The end of the wars produced its own catastrophe. As independence came, between 500,000 and 1 million Portuguese citizens left Africa for a country most of them had never lived in. They were called the retornados, the returnees. Most arrived with what they could carry. They were absorbed by a Portugal that was itself trying to work out what kind of country it was going to be. For the Africans who had fought on the Portuguese side, there was no equivalent welcome. Many were left behind to face the new governments that had been their enemies. Some made it to Portugal, others did not. The Portugal that emerged from the next 2 years of revolutionary turbulence, the Processo Revolucionario em Curso, was a parliamentary democracy. It joined what would become the European Union in 1986 and still observes the 25th of April as Freedom Day. The Aljube prison, where the secret police had once interrogated suspects, became a museum about the dictatorship, but not until 2015, 41 years after the Carnations. The political scientist Samuel Huntington later argued that the world's third great wave of democratization began in Lisbon on the 25th of April 1974. Within 18 months, the colonels in Greece had fallen, and Franco's regime in Spain had ended with his death. Within 15 years, the same wave reached Latin America and then Eastern Europe. None of those transitions were quite like Portugal's, where the army that had been sent to fight a colonial war ended both the war and the dictatorship that had ordered it, and the population came out to give them flowers. 6 years earlier, in a bedroom in the São Bento Palace, an old man had been reading a single newspaper printed for him alone. Whatever he believed about the country he thought he was still governing, the country itself had stopped believing it long before he did. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to see more stories about how power is won and lost, please like and subscribe, and let us know in the comments which story we should cover next.